The opening stages of battle on the 4th of June 1942 were a resounding success for the United States Navy, as 3 Japanese carriers were bombed, burning, and out of service. Unfortunately, not everything was worth celebrating, as Task Force 17, which under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, had the aircraft carrier Yorktown at its disposition, and it had been spotted by a reconnaissance aircraft launched from the heavy cruiser Chikuma. The reconnaissance plane immediately sends Yorktown's position and the weather surrounding the carrier. However, I do want to mention that at this point in the war, the Japanese believe Yorktown had already been sunk during the Battle of Coral Sea in early May, so they inevitably misidentify the carrier. With the information having been received, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, aboard Carrier Division 2's Hiru, ordered a strike wave of 18 vals and 6 Zeros to attack the carrier. This assembly of aircraft would begin launching at 12:58. Roughly an hour later, at 13:52, Yorktown's radar made contact with the strike wave bearing 255 degrees and 32 miles away from the carrier. They were at low altitude and steadily climbing. Yorktown was caught off guard at a vulnerable moment, as it was attempting to land VB-3, and it had aircraft on the deck that were being refueled and rearmed. Once contact had been made with Hiru's strike wave, Yorktown radioed VB-3, informing the pilots that they needed to break their landing circle, and they also needed to clear the area to prevent themselves from being hit by anti-aircraft fire. The rearmament of aircraft on the deck was discontinued, and an 800-gallon tank of gasoline was dumped over the side. Yorktown then began to enter evasive action, and at 13:55, Lieutenant Kobayashi, in one of the attack aircraft, spotted Yorktown and radioed back to Hiru. "We are attacking the enemy carrier." At 14:04, when the strike wave was roughly 5 miles away from Yorktown, Yorktown signaled its CAP fighters. "Okay, break 'em up." The Japanese formation broke apart, and a few of their planes were shot down, and before long, F-4Fs from Enterprise and Hornet were on the scene, joining the shootout. A few moments later, Yorktown's fire control director ordered all guns that could bear on the target to open fire. The Japanese were now under the full pressure of the task force, but at least 7 vals would make it through the fire. At roughly 14:10, Yorktown would fall victim to 3 direct bomb hits. The first hit was a high-explosive 250-kilogram bomb that landed aft of Elevator 2 on the starboard side and exploded around frame 132, blowing a 12-foot hole in the flight deck. The numbers 3 and 4 1.1-inch quad-mount anti-aircraft guns aft of the island suffered heavy casualties, as 14 men were wounded and 5 were outright killed, with the number 4 mount being permanently disabled. The force of the explosion also sent splinters down into the hangar deck, lighting 3 SBDs on fire, 2 from Enterprise and 1 from Yorktown. The one from Yorktown was fully fueled and armed with a 1,000-pound bomb. Lieutenant Emerson, who was a hangar deck officer, pressed a button which remotely activated the ship's sprinkler system and the water curtains for the hangar deck. The flames were luckily extinguished before any catastrophic explosions occurred. The second bomb was a 250-kilogram semi-armor-piercing bomb that penetrated the flight deck at frame 95, 10 feet inboard from the island in the vicinity of the uptakes. The bomb would pierce the funnel uptakes in the hangar deck and then pierce the hangar deck, exploding in the deck below near the executive officer's office. The ship's uptakes were destroyed in the vicinity of the bomb's explosion, 2 boilers were disabled, 3 had their fires snuffed out, and poisonous gases began to fill the boiler rooms. Up to that point, Yorktown had been traveling at roughly 30.5 knots, but with the boiler rooms being evacuated, the ship began to lose way, and damage control teams were attempting to extinguish fires that were started by the bomb in one of the rag rooms, a film processing room, and on the paint on the inside of the funnel. These fires would cause extensive, thick black smoke to build up outside of the ship, which blocked visibility from the after main battery fire control director and the after starboard side anti-aircraft guns. The third and final bomb was also a 250-kilogram semi-armor-piercing bomb that penetrated the number 1 elevator near the centerline of the ship, where it would explode in compartment A305A, causing a massive fire amongst rags and stores. The explosion of the bomb also caused splinter damage to several bulkheads within its vicinity. It was ordered that the emergency sprinkler system for the ship's forward magazine be activated in order to reduce the chance of an explosion occurring. However, the bomb disabled the circuits for the remote activation, and so the sprinkler system failed to activate. Damage control parties immediately set out to contain the flames, using CO2, water, and foam hoses, along with flooding a few rooms aft of the flames in the forward end of the ship. Meanwhile, the Japanese had lost 13 of their 18 VALs and 3 of the 6 Zeros, but they claimed 6 direct bomb hits. Upon leaving the scene, Yorktown was merely a massive ball of smoke, and so the Japanese assumed they had sunk yet another U.S. carrier. However, they were wrong. Given some time, all of the flames, except the ones that occurred within the ship's funnel, would be contained and extinguished. The gases entering the boiler rooms were also brought under control, and all but 2 of the ship's boilers were relit, and given time, Yorktown would build itself back up to 18 knots. Finally, the hole in the flight deck caused by the first bomb would be covered up using wooden beams and steel planking, which was spiked to the wooden deck. It took a mere 30 minutes for the repair party to cover up that hole. During this time, Rear Admiral Fletcher would make the decision to abandon the Yorktown, as the ship was immobile, its communication system was going offline, and its radar was disabled. So, he would transfer his flag to the heavy cruiser Astoria. While Astoria would maneuver itself alongside Yorktown, with the hole having been patched on the after end of the flight deck, at 14:37, Yorktown would resume landing operations. At 15:24, Fletcher would successfully board the Astoria with his staff. At 15:50, the Black Gang, working away at the boilers, finally got them to a position where they could get the ship to move, and, for the first time since the ship was damaged, it began to move under its own power. By this point, Yorktown's radar had also restored power, and, at 15:55, just 5 minutes after the ship started to move, it picked up a group of enemy aircraft approaching from 340 degrees at 35 miles distance and closing. This group was comprised of 10 Kate torpedo bombers, along with 6 fighter escorts. Just like with the first attack, the Japanese caught Yorktown at a terrible time. It was attempting to refuel 10 aircraft on the flight deck using its aviation fuel lines, and it had only just started fueling the first one. Upon receiving the warning that Japanese aircraft were closing in, the Yorktown's hangar personnel filled the gasoline lines with CO2. By 16:28, Yorktown was sailing at 18 knots, and Task Force 17 had assumed anti-aircraft formation. At 16:39, Astoria made visual contact with the Japanese aircraft, and 1 minute later, Yorktown launched a few F-4F fighter planes. While still launching these planes at a distance of 15,000 yards, Yorktown's 5-inch 38 caliber main battery opened fire. The Japanese aircraft had divided themselves into 4 independent formations in order to separate anti-aircraft fire and hostile fighters. This was an excellent decision on the part of the Japanese, as, while they were losing a heavy amount of aircraft, several planes did make it through Task Force 17's defenses, and at least 4 torpedoes were dropped towards Yorktown, and at 16:45, 2 would hit. The first torpedo would strike roughly 15 feet below the water at frame 80 on the port side, flooding compartments in the vicinity of the forward generator room and causing Yorktown to take on a 6-degree list to port. A few seconds later, the second torpedo would plow into the port side in the vicinity of frame 92, and the explosion was so powerful that it disfigured a catwalk above it. The situation on board Yorktown was devastating. The ship's list increased to upwards of 27 degrees, its rudder was jammed, and it lost power to its propulsion system for a second time this day, and so it went dead in the water. Captain Buckmaster would instantly receive a series of reports that painted a grim situation. All of the boilers had their fires snuffed out by the explosion of the second torpedo, which is why the ship lost power. With the ship having lost power, none of the pumps could be activated, meaning there was no attempt to counterflood, the oil in the ship's fuel tanks could not be adjusted to the starboard side to reduce the list, and no water could be ejected from any of the flooding compartments. Communications across the ship also went offline, with the bridge being unable to maintain contact with the main engine rooms, the forward and after generator compartments, repair parties, and the pump control stations. With it appearing that Yorktown was under the threat of capsizing to port, Captain Buckmaster had to make a difficult decision. There was no time to lose. In order to save as many of the ship's company as possible, I ordered the ship abandoned. 5 destroyers, Benham, Russell, Balch, Anderson, and Hammond, would begin rescuing Yorktown survivors as they abandoned the carrier. At 1800, a false air alarm was reported, and the destroyers scattered, ceasing their recovery operations. However, once it was recognized there was no threat of an attack, they would resume. By roughly 1900, Yorktown was abandoned, and by that point, 2 more destroyers had arrived to assist in the evacuation. These were the Hughes and Morris. By the time the ship was abandoned, its condition had stabilized, and Rear Admiral Fletcher was now entertaining the idea that Yorktown could possibly be saved. So, while the survivors were being dispersed amongst the rescue ships, a salvage party was to be assembled. At 2000, the bulk of Task Force 17 would abandon Yorktown, heading eastward, but Admiral Fletcher had detached the Hughes to remain on standby with Yorktown, with the orders to destroy it should anyone attempt to board it or if its condition worsened. At 8:26 a.m. on the 5th of June, Hughes radar picked up a plane bearing 295 degrees, 20 miles distant, and this was the No. 4 reconnaissance plane from the heavy cruiser Chikuma, which had also spotted the Yorktown. It sent a radio transmission back to Chikuma, enemy Yorktown-class carrier listing to starboard and drifting. Clearly, it's worth mentioning that Yorktown was actually listing to port and not starboard, but given the distance that Chikuma's reconnaissance aircraft was from the ship, it's easy to understand how this mistake was made. Over the course of June 5th, Captain Buckmaster was transferred to the Astoria, where he would discuss salvage operations of Yorktown with Rear Admiral Fletcher, and a rescue party was assembled aboard a series of destroyers, the Hammond, Balch, and Benham. A total of 30 officers and 141 crew were selected to board the Yorktown, and at 2000 on the 5th of June 1942, the 3 destroyers would depart Task Force 17 under the command of Captain Buckmaster. 3 other vessels had also made their way to Yorktown's position. The former minesweeper, now fleet tug, Vero, along with the destroyers Monaghan and Gwyn. All 3 of these vessels had arrived at Yorktown's position during the late hours of the 5th of June, and the Gwyn had actually dispatched a salvage party onto the Yorktown, which detached the port side anchor and also ejected one of the ship's launches from the after deck. Once night fell, this party would return to the Gwyn and await sunrise. While Gwyn's party was on board Yorktown, they also connected it to the Vero, which began tugging the Yorktown towards Pearl Harbor. By 5:30 a.m. on the 6th of June, the 3 destroyers under the command of Buckmaster were approaching Yorktown's position, and so was another vessel, the I-168, which was acting on the information provided by Chikuma's No. 4 plane the previous day. At 6 a.m., I-168 would spot Yorktown at roughly 11 miles distance, and so the submarine would dive in order to make an approach, and at 6:15, the Hammond put alongside Yorktown's starboard side, and the salvage party began boarding the ship. Machinist Williams would later describe what it was like reboarding the abandoned ship. Yorktown was dark and dead silent. Darkness isn't black enough for the void that was in her. The silence was overwhelming. You got an eerie, unearthly, dreamlike feeling when you walked her decks and went below. I can't quite put into words the lonesome, dead feeling that was in her. With Yorktown having no power of its own, Hammond had to supply pumps in order to conduct counterflooding, and it also had to supply hoses to combat small fires that were still active. The salvage party also began cutting away 5 of the 20mm machine guns on the port side, and the No. 4 5-inch 38 caliber anti-aircraft gun, which would eventually be dumped as well. They also began removing aircraft from the hangar and pushing them over the side. The efforts were proving successful, as Yorktown's list had been slightly reduced to 22 degrees to port. However, at 15:34, at a range of 1,200 yards, I-168 in position fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. The screening destroyer spotted the torpedoes, and Hammond began to move in reverse. However, at 15:36, 1 torpedo plowed into Hammond amidships, causing the destroyer to split in half and sink. A further 2 torpedoes would plow into Yorktown's starboard side at frames 84 and 95, causing extensive flooding. A few minutes after Hammond was hit by the torpedo, it sank, and on its afterdeck, it had depth charges that were set to detonate at a predetermined depth. Once the ship's wreckage had reached that depth, those depth charges exploded, killing several survivors in the water, and also causing further damage to Yorktown's lower hull. As the salvage party began to abandon Yorktown, they were closing watertight doors along their way, just in case the ship would survive this event as well. However, the submarine's torpedoes would be fatal. Over the course of the day, there would be a noticeable reduction in Yorktown's port list. However, the ship was noticeably riding lower and lower in the water as more flooding occurred on the starboard side. As for I-168, it had set a course to go underneath the Yorktown as it was sinking, and then it would zigzag until it had eluded all attacks from the U.S. destroyers. By the late evening, the submarine had surfaced and fled at high speed. Unfortunately for Yorktown, its battle damage was too severe. Several bulkheads were damaged, or were simply left open, and this allowed progressive flooding to take over the ship. Throughout the early hours of June 7th, its port list began to increase. By 6:58 a.m. on the 7th of June, 1942, Yorktown turned over on her port side and sank in about 3,000 fathoms of water, with all battle flags flying. Out of the roughly 2,300 men that would be aboard Yorktown over the course of the Battle of Midway, only 141 would perish with the ship. Yorktown would be the second U.S. aircraft carrier lost during the Second World War. However, its loss was well worth the trade, since it had participated in the destruction of 5 Japanese aircraft carriers. Its service during the war would prove short, but invaluable. With that having been said, there is nothing more to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.